We talked about a couple of verses in the New Testament that discuss what you do when you're living as a minority, as a Christian, in a place where unbelievers are the majority, which when Paul wrote the letter to Ephesus, that's who he was writing to. He was a minority. He was in prison in Rome. They were a minority who he was writing to in the church at Ephesus. And then Sunday, I followed that up by talking about some of the ways we are a minority in our culture as believers and as Christians, and how that's different from the way it used to be some time ago. I must say, as I ended that lesson Sunday and said, what do we have to have? We have to have Christian character, that the character we're going to look at tonight, who was in the minority, is the best case type we could ever hope for. I have learned so much and been challenged in so many ways the last couple of weeks while I've been studying for this series, and particularly for this character, because it fits so precisely with the day and age in which we live. The book of Daniel begins with these two verses. During the third year of King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim of Judah and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. So I want to make sure you understand what happens here. Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylonia and placed those sacred objects in the treasure house of his God. So I want you to understand the time and the period here. The story begins in 605 BC, before Christ. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of one of the most powerful empires in history, the Babylonian Empire, waged war on Egypt and Syria, and in the process conquered the holy city of Jerusalem, and he conquered the Egyptian puppet king of Judah, Jehoiakim, and looted the temple of God. And we're told another place in Scripture that God authored Jehoiakim's defeat and conquest as a result of the people's idolatry. Wonder how that would fit with today. In essence, God was saying to his people, if you want to survive idols, I'm not going to let you stay in your home country. I'm going to send you to a land that is teeming with idols, including your own, that have been snatched from you. So Nebuchadnezzar took the sacred treasures back to Babylon and placed them in the temple of his own gods, but that's not all he took back. He not only took the jewels, he took some of the Jews. Some of the best Jews, the brightest, best, and noblest among the young teenage men. The next verse says the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, we'll come back to that term in a minute, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. Select only strong, healthy, good-looking young men, he said. Make sure they are well-versed in every branch of learning, are gifted with knowledge and good judgment, and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and the literature of Babylon. You see, when the Babylonians conquered a people, it wasn't just the Jews. When the Babylonians conquered a people, they had as a part of their custom and their practice and their tradition to choose out from among the captives the cream of the crop, the finest young men to be trained and employed in the service of the court of Babylon. Understand, these boys that we're going to read about that were selected had barely been bar mitzvahed. We're pretty certain they were 14 to 16 years old. Teenagers, but talented, educated. and good looking, he said, teenagers, but barely high school freshmen or sophomores. The who's who of young Jews were taken from everything that was familiar to them, from their home, from their family, from their temple, and were made into an immediate minority and shipped 650 miles to a glittering place in the capital of paganism, Babylon. There were probably more than the 4 we're going to read about in the early chapters of Daniel, but there were at least 4. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were sort of POWs in the sense they had no choice in the matter. So these 4 boys, I've tried to think about them, and I sat there for a minute and thought about them walking the red brick streets of Babylon and seeing what was at that time the most impressive city in the world, including one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And so they're taken by captive there, and they're walking through the city streets, and it's all before them. And they, though they're captive, have also been given the privilege of, they could simply become Babylonians and become a part of the majestic government. That's pretty tempting. That's pretty tempting. Power's hard to turn down. Privilege is hard to turn down. But that's where it got complicated. Because the goal of the Babylonian king was to reprogram these young men, strip them of all of their former identities and way of life, and indoctrinate them in the culture and the customs, and as we read in the text, the language and the learning and the literature of the Babylonians. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar wanted to wean them off their country, but he also wanted to wean them off their God and their religion. He wanted to deconstruct their faith and turn them into idol-worshiping pagans. So he designed a 3-year brainwashing program with this process in mind. The king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. They were to be trained for 3 years, then they would go into royal service. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 of the young men chosen, all from the tribe of Judah. The chief of staff renamed them. They're not even going to get to keep their names. It's going to get worse a little later on. The chief of staff renamed them with these Babylonian names. Daniel was called Belteshazzar. Hananiah was called Shadrach. Mishael was called Meshach. Azariah was called Abednego. Now, understand, they have lost everything they knew. And they're now students at the University of Babel. And you talk about a meal plan. This isn't the student cafeteria at the local Christian school. This is the king's meal plan. Very same meal plan, it said that the king himself had. The king's food was the best money could buy. And all the wine they could drink. It says that. It was like a keg party at the secular university. And you're 15, 16. Parents aren't around. Temple leaders aren't around. You're being, in a sense, at this age, almost offered what Jesus was offered in the temptations in Matthew chapter 4. Look out. You can have all this. And as if this weren't tempting enough, they were renamed with these pagan names. Here's the flavor of what's happening. The Hebrew name Daniel means God is my judge. But it gets replaced with a Babylonian name, Belteshazzar, which means protect the life of the king. It means follow the God of Babylon, Bel, B-E-L. That will protect you. So each one of these Hebrew teenagers are stripped of their God-glorifying names because, as I've told you many times before, Jews were very careful about the names they gave to their children. Names carried great weight, great meaning. And each of them are stripped with their God-given names and are giving these pagan names, honoring blasphemous idols of Babylon. The whole process was intended to break down their faith in God, convert them into good pagans at every level, where they go to school, what they eat, what they drink, how they recreate, what their name is, what their faith will be. Total indoctrination. Total takeover of their identity. Do you see what's happening here? More importantly, in today's culture and society, do you see what's happening here? Not just do you see what's happening here. In Daniel chapter 1, do you see what's happening here? There is a devilish attempt to change our identity, to turn us into captives of what Paul told the Corinthians was the God of this world, little g. And it's happening right under our noses and right in front of our eyes all the time. It sounds a little bit like what happens to kids today, and I've seen this happen I don't know how many times. To kids who grow up in Christian families, they grow up in our church, they go to our Sunday school, they go to our kids' activities, they go to our youth program. We have a senior honors night for them. And then they go off to a secular university, and everything they've been taught at home, at church, among their friend and faith community is completely stripped down from them. Almost immediately. Immediately their faith comes under attack. And unless they're a Daniel, they're not ready. At home and church, they were a part of a Christian majority. So they never had to add muscle to their faith. They never had to live Christianity from the inside out. It was always from the outside in. And that's hard to do when you're suddenly not a majority. You're an overwhelming minority, and you are in a secular university in every way. Ill-equipped to take a stand or to handle the world. Here's a scary stat. Did you know that 80% of all animals, when they are released in the wild, are eaten by other animals? 80%. No feelings there, no PETA there. 80% of animals are eaten by other animals. They're predator. And reared in a protected environment, kids today are like that. They're unable to cope with the harshness of real life and the real world when they get out there. They grow up sometimes in this faith-filled subculture and are never aware what goes on beyond the walls of their faith. That's why for me personally, growing up, being involved in inner city ministry was the greatest and best thing that ever happened for my spiritual life, because I got outside the walls of just my church building and my home, and I saw how the real world was living. And it was completely different. And you had to swim or drown, one or the other. Because growing up in the majority can give us a false sense of security. And minority status forces our faith to survive even in the wild. That's why I said Sunday what I did, that minority status can be good for us. Christianity has always grown in the face of minority status. And it has, throughout history, always declined when it's a majority. And people just get comfortable with it. And it becomes nothing more than cultural Christianity. You see, when you're in the minority, you learn to take tough stands. Nothing comes easy. Rather than seeking the path of least resistance all the time, you have to stand for what is right in order to survive. And it's going to get worse for Daniel. As if being renamed wasn't denigrating enough, there's going to be potentially, we can't prove this, but potentially a more devastating attack on his personhood. You see, we know this, and I'm going to show you in the text, but we also know this from history. In the court of Oriental kings, there was a custom to prevent the royal princesses from falling in love with the king's male servants. The king had them men castrated. It kept the royal harem hanky-panky free. Did you notice in verse 3 the title given to Ashpenaz, who is going to take Daniel under his wing? Well, it depends on what translation you're reading it in. We read it in the NLT. The king spoke unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel of the king's seed and the princes. Another, verse 9. It's three times, actually. I believe it's verse 11 as well, but I didn't have room to put that on the screen. I know it's three times it says the prince of the eunuchs. That's who Ashpenaz was. That's who's going to have control of Daniel. And we know that Ashpenaz was Daniel's overseer. We know this was his job. Could it be that Daniel was assigned to Ashpenaz because he was going to experience this himself, or did experience this himself? In addition to all these other humiliations that Daniel and his pals had forced upon them, they may have been neutered. They likely were. Imagine Daniel, a young man, robbed of his dignity, confused by new scenery, a part of the minority, 15, 16 years old, experiencing all these traumas. So, I don't know about you, but if it were me, I might be tempted to cut these boys some slack. I might be tempted to say, all right, it's okay if they compromise a little in some areas. Maybe not be quite so difficult on them. But Daniel isn't looking for excuses. He's answering to a new name. He's wearing new clothes. He has a new address. He speaks a new language. He's in a new school, learning a new curriculum. Every single thing in the world seems to have changed for Daniel, but one thing. That is his heart. Was it Jim Valvano, the basketball coach who died from cancer, and all the cancer money's been raised for him? I forget what it's called, the V Fund. And he said near the end of his life, cancer can take away my body and my ability to think and act, but it can't take away my heart, my soul. There's Daniel. Daniel was determined not to defile himself. Not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given them by the king. So he asked Ashpenaz for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. Yeah, it's kind of hard for, I probably would have, look, I'm admitting I probably would have been in the position where I said, Daniel, go ahead. You've already gone through a lot. You've already suffered through a lot. Wrong. This attitude that Daniel took is so foreign to today's half-baked cultural Christianity that we no longer even can understand it, pretty much. His heart, though, had not changed, and he would not defile himself. That's an interesting word. And so I looked it up several different places, and the word defile means to taint or pollute. In the Hebrew language here, the word that is used means to taint or pollute, and what it says is that is the exact opposite of purity. And one of the commentaries that I read gave this example. It said, imagine a nurse taking a blood sample, then leaving the vial on the counter overnight. You would say that the sample was compromised. Probably doesn't have integrity anymore. You have a reason to doubt its purity. Maybe it's not what it appeared to be. But Daniel didn't want that to happen. He didn't want anybody to question his loyalty to God. He refused to do anything or say anything or act in any way that would defile or compromise his devotion to the Lord. He couldn't help what had happened to him. He couldn't help that he was a captive. He couldn't help his place in the palace, the strange customs and language, the new home, the new occupation, the new school. He couldn't help it. There's nothing he could do about it. But he could keep his heart right. Listen to me, church. If the culture continues to deteriorate for Christians, I don't know whether it will or not, because I don't know what God is going to do. I'm convinced God is at work. If I wasn't convinced of that, I'd give up. But I'm not convinced that God being at work means that I'm going to be comfortable. Those are different things. But if the culture continues to deteriorate, there may not be much we can do about it. Work-wise, politically, personally. But we can do this. We can make sure our own heart is right with God. And in his case, he could control what he put in his mouth. He could control the food he ate. He could control the beverage he drank. Those were his choice. Now, you got to understand this passage. Being a Jew, Daniel was bound by Old Testament dietary laws, and to ignore these kosher laws would be to disobey God. And certainly an idolatrous king wasn't keeping kosher. Not only that, but the meats and the wine served to a pagan king had been previously offered as sacrifices to strange gods and idols, and Daniel knew that, and he didn't want to eat food that had been compromised to idols. And this issue comes up later in the church. Do you remember over in the church in Corinth? Because it was a common practice in that day. So he didn't want to take the risk of defiling himself and offending God in any way. It's true that Daniel was being assimilated into the culture, and there's not much he could do about that. It's expected. We are all swimming in a sea of culture. Whether we realize it or not, every day we too are being indoctrinated in certain ways. We listen to things we didn't listen to years ago. We watch things we didn't watch years ago. We do things we didn't do years ago. We don't do things we did years ago. It's slowly happening to us. It's a little bit like the frog boiling in the kettle. but we are all swimming in a sea of culture. It's not always our fault. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's our choice. Sometimes it happens as osmosis or evolution of lifestyle. But it wasn't a matter of how far he could compromise and still please God. It was, I have a standard I will not violate. He chose his. He picked the mountain, the hill he would fight on. For him, it was diet because it was so important to Old Testament Jews. For you, me, it may be something else. For me, it is something else. But for you, it may be something different. I want you to understand what I'm saying and how it applies to us today. What tempts you may not tempt me, and vice versa. What I might have to take a stand on might be different from what you have to take a stand on because of what we're tempted by. I want you to understand the comparison here. Daniel spoke like a Babylonian. He dressed like a Babylonian. He learned Babylonian protocol. He attended a Babylonian university. He answered to a Babylonian name and to a Babylonian overlord. He's going to occupy a position in the Babylonian court, and he's going to occupy it for, get this, 70 years. But he never became a Babylonian at heart. Not right here. He never became a Babylonian at heart. He knew where to draw the line, and he did it. If you want to be a Daniel in an outnumbered culture, you are going to need conviction. So let me just ask you this question. I don't want anybody to answer out loud, but I certainly want you to answer in your heart, in your mind, and in your conscience right now. Do you have any unbreakable allegiances because of your faith? Do you have any beliefs that are set in stone and poured in concrete? Because you are not going to violate them. That's what Daniel did here. If you want to be uncompromised in an outnumbered culture, that's what you have to do. You have to have some beliefs that are set in stone, poured in concrete, that you are not ever going to compromise. Sort of reminds me of the fellow who proposed marriage to his girlfriend. She said, when you save $1 million, I'll marry you. 3 months later, she asked him, honey, how much money have you saved? And he said, $75. She said, well, that sounds close enough to me. What Christian beliefs have you held that sounds close enough to me? I'll sell it out pretty quick. Well, then it's not a belief. It's just an assent. It is not a belief. It is just a mental assent. See, it's one thing to know what's right, even desire to do what's right, but neither knowledge or desire or good intentions constitute a conviction. Daniel purposed in his heart what he would do and not do. Now, when I used to teach teenagers, and when I was a youth minister, and then taught teenagers for a year after that, and then wrote several teenage books, and then spoke on too many teenage conferences and conventions, I would often say this: you decide in advance. See, that's compromised right now. You decide in advance what you will and will not do on a date or in a relationship. You don't wait until your parents or his parents or her parents are out of town. You don't wait until it's Friday night in the back seat of a car or it's the prom. You decide in advance what you will and will not do. And if you don't, you're going to lose. You are going to lose. You're going to lose to swimming in the sea of the culture. You're going to lose to your emotions. You're going to lose to your feelings. But if you purpose in your heart, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he will not defile himself. You won't. You have any beliefs that are set in stone, poured in concrete? Frank McConnor, a brilliant writer, wrote about his childhood in Ireland, and he said that as kids, they would run through the orchards, and when they came upon a wall that was too tall, seemed too tall for them to get over, that what they would do is they would take their hats off and throw it over the wall. So the only choice they had was to get over it any way they could, or they were going to lose their hats. What as a Christian is it that you have tossed over the wall that you got to go get it, despite the obstacle, despite the uncertainty? You're not going to run away. You're not going to back down. You're not going to turn back. You're going to go over one way or the other. Daniel doesn't know exactly how he's going to solve his problem. He doesn't know what he's going to do. He just knows what he's not going to do. And by the way, that, my friends, is an okay place to start. What was the first thing Daniel did? What I'm sure were many choices. He decided what he wasn't going to do. Daniel purposed in his heart not, before he purposed in his heart to. When you're in the minority, sometimes that's the choice you have to make about conviction. There's something else you don't hear about a lot, and I'll close with this in the last few moments, and that is you also need some savvy navigation when you're going through these cultural waters that we're all swimming in. You see, here's what I find stunning in Daniel's story. He doesn't pick at the cafeteria. He doesn't go on a hunger strike. He doesn't turn over his tray and pitch a fit. He doesn't get mad that the Babylonians don't share his convictions. What do you do when your beliefs, boy, is this appropriate right now? What do you do when your beliefs are not shared by unbelievers? Well, can I ask you something? What do you expect? What do you expect from people who are unbelievers? That always amazes me that Christians are stunned that the culture doesn't hold their values. It's always amazed me that a Christian is appalled that his company stays open on Sundays. Why shouldn't it? If the only goal is to make a buck, do I want to make a buck 7 days a week or 5 or 6 days a week? Why shouldn't your buddy get high if he's got nothing else to live for but a good time? Why not join the sex revolution if all that matters is feeling good? Why do Christians get upset and mad when unbelievers act like unbelievers? What do we expect? Without a biblical understanding of values and character and sexual standards and morality, without a biblical understanding of those things, that won't make sense at all. And so Daniel realizes that Ashpenaz, his supervisor, will never understand his decision to not eat the best food in the world, to not drink the best wine in the world. So Daniel said, didn't go on a hunger strike, didn't pitch a fit, didn't organize the Jews for a picket or a march. Daniel said, just test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water. At the end of the 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food. Then make your decision in light of what you see. Now, God had given Ashpenaz both respect and affection for Daniel, but he responded just like I would have, you would have, any unbeliever would have. I'm afraid of my Lord the King, who has ordered that you eat this food and wine. If you become pale and thin compared to the other youths your age, I'm afraid the king will have me beheaded. I can understand Ashpenaz responding that way, can't you? When the world isn't sympathetic or empathetic to our cause, you got to navigate that just a little bit. You got to know what's essential and what's not. What hill are you willing to die on? What hill are you willing to navigate or negotiate on a little bit? It requires a little navigation from us, just like it did from Daniel. I'll fight about some things. I'm not going to fight about others. That's true in the world and the culture. It's also true in the church, by the way. There are some things you are not going to get me to argue about in the church. I could a dozen or more off the top of my head, if we had the time, I could tell you about. You want to take one side? Okay, I'll take the other. But I'm not, or I'll take the other and you take that one. I'm not going to fuss and argue about every single point of doctrine. I'm going to fuss and argue about what's big and important, but not everything. And Ashpenaz has a point. Why should he be expected to risk his neck over Daniel's convictions? Sometimes Christians, I'm afraid, climb up on their self-righteous high horse to point out what's wrong with the world without ever offering up any kind of hopeful or helpful alternative. That's why I love Lifeline Family Center. And we, by the way, for the fourth year in a row, we've had the most people who have walked and given the Lifeline Family Center. Now, we're nowhere near the fourth largest church in the area, nowhere near it. We're a large church, but not nowhere near that. But we have been committed to the idea of you can't just complain about abortion. You've got to offer some sort of alternative that is helpful and hopeful. And it always bothered me for years how Christians just complain constantly about abortion and might carry a picket sign, but won't help a girl save her baby. So Daniel suggests a test here. It's not just about his convictions, it's also about the Babylonians' objectives, because they want these kids trained well. They want healthy civil servants. So Daniel gives the king what he wants as well as pleases God. And it's extraordinary how God gets glorified by this. At the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned by the king. Now, there's no biological reason for that. In fact, there's every reason that shouldn't be true. There is no biological reason the vegetarian tacos would have made this much difference in 10 days, except for the fact that God honored Daniel's faith and honored his conviction. And so verses 16 and 17 says, after that, the attendant fed them only vegetables instead of the food and wine provided for the others. God gave these 4 young men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature. And we'll see, he not only honored their bodies, he honored their brains. And God gave Daniel, and this is going to be important here in the next chapter, God gave Daniel the special ability to interpret the meanings of visions and dreams. I wish I had him around today. And this needs to be the strategy of a Christian minority. Yes, the numbers are against us. Yes, sometimes we are operating today in hostile territory, whether it's at school, at work, in the neighborhood, maybe even in our own family. Yes, the media will boo us or shun us or ignore us or hate us or call us names. But rather than be intimidated into the closet, we need to put our convictions on display. That's how we respond. But we do it with integrity and character, and we don't do it in a mean and nasty way. We don't. And I just love verse 21. Daniel remained in the royal service until the first year of the reign of King Cyrus. So from the time of this story in Daniel chapter 1 until the first year of the Persian king Cyrus' victory over Babylon, 70 years elapsed. Do you hear that? Daniel was in the minority, but he outlived the emperor and even the empire that took him captive. Because he knew what hill to stand on, he had a conviction in his heart, and he was flexible with other convictions. And he trusted God to help him with the rest of life. Wow. There's our roadmap right now, Christians. There's our roadmap. When I was a kid, one Christmas I got one of those inflatable punching bags that were weighted in the bottom, and I can still see it. I can still see it in my mind, the picture of it. I don't know how many of you had one. They still have them around, I think. They were weighted in the bottom. You could slap them and knock them over. It stayed in our basement of our house. You could sock it as hard as you could, and the bag man always bounced back up. One day a father asked his son if he knew why the inflatable man always came back up. The little boy said, because he's standing up on the inside. Because he's standing up on the inside. That's how, my friends, faith survives when you're in the minority. You make sure you are always standing up on the inside. You make sure that no matter what else happens around you on the outside, you purpose in your heart that you will not defile yourself and that you will honor God.